Good evening, friends. Tonight we step through the heavy oak doors of medieval chambers to witness how marriage meant surrendering not just your future, but your most intimate moments to the eyes of many. We'll explore bedding ceremonies where priests blessed sheets, wedding guests threw stockings for luck, and newlyweds drank spiced wine while crowds lingered far too close. Ceremonies where privacy was a foreign concept and consummation became community theater. If these gentle journeys through history help quiet your mind, consider tapping like and subscribe, and in the comments below, share where you're listening from and what hour greets you in your part of the world. I'm always moved by how our sleepy gathering spans continents and time zones. So lower your lights, let the modern world fade into shadow, find that comfortable position you've been seeking, and allow yourself to drift back to an age when torchlight flickered on stone walls, when marriages were witnessed by dozens, and when a woman's wedding night was anything but her own. Imagine yourself in a medieval village on a crisp autumn evening in the year 1350. The church bells have just finished ringing, announcing that another couple has been bound in holy matrimony. But unlike the private celebrations you might know, this wedding is far from over. In fact, the most public part of the evening is just beginning. You stand among a crowd of villagers, all pressed together in the great hall of the local manor house. The air is thick with smoke from tallow candles and the massive hearth fire. Everyone has been drinking ale since midday, and the mood grows increasingly boisterous as darkness falls. The bride sits at the high table, her face flushed from wine and embarrassment in equal measure. She knows what comes next. Everyone knows. The bedding ceremony was not merely tradition. It was considered essential to the validity of the marriage itself. Without witnesses to the couple being placed together in the marriage bed, questions might arise later about whether the union was truly complete. In an age where marriages sealed property transfers, political alliances, and family fortunes, nothing could be left to chance or private discretion. As the evening feast winds down, the crowd begins to stir with anticipation. The groomsmen rise first, their movements slightly unsteady from hours of drinking. They approach the groom with knowing grins and ribald jokes. Meanwhile, the bridesmaids surround the bride, their laughter high and nervous. This is the moment everyone has been waiting for, the public escort to the bedchamber. The procession begins with music. Pipes and drums create a rhythm that is both celebratory and slightly ominous. The entire wedding party, along with family members, important villagers, and anyone else who can squeeze into the corridor, follows the couple toward their chamber. Imagine yourself swept along in this tide of humanity, torches casting wild shadows on the walls, the smell of sweat, ale, and wet wool filling your nostrils. The bride walks slowly, supported by her attendants. Her new husband strides ahead, encouraged by backslapping and crude encouragement from his companions. The noise is tremendous. Singing, shouting, the occasional crash as someone stumbles into furniture. Privacy is not just absent. It's actively rejected as contrary to the communal nature of this vital ritual. Upon reaching the bedchamber, the crowd doesn't simply deposit the couple and leave. Oh no, the ceremony is just reaching its crescendo. The room itself has been prepared hours in advance. Fresh rushes cover the floor, mixed with herbs like lavender and rosemary to sweeten the air. The bed, often the most valuable piece of furniture a family owns, has been dressed in the finest linens available, sometimes borrowed, sometimes gifted, always scrutinized by the assembled witnesses. The bridesmaids now perform their duty of preparing the bride. They remove her outer garments while she stands in the center of the room, surrounded by watching eyes. Layer by layer, her wedding finery is stripped away, her ornate overdress, her kirtle, down to her linen shift. Each piece is handled with ceremony, folded carefully, while the bride shivers. Whether from cold or mortification, it's impossible to say. Meanwhile, the groomsmen perform the same service for the husband. His doublet is removed with much jest and commentary. His hose are pulled off while he hops on one foot, trying to maintain some dignity. The crowd roars with laughter at every stumble, every moment of awkwardness. This public undressing serves multiple purposes. It confirms that both parties are physically capable of consummation, it removes any hidden weapons or charms, and it reinforces the community's role in this union. Now comes the blessing of the marriage bed itself. The local priest, if he hasn't drunk too much at the feast, steps forward with his aspergillum, the wooden rod used to sprinkle holy water. He walks around the bed 3 times, muttering prayers in Latin that few understand but all recognize. The bed must be purified, made sacred for what is about to occur. Some priests are more thorough than others, sprinkling not just the bed but the walls, the floor, even the watching crowd. With the bed blessed, the couple is helped into it. They lie side by side, the covers pulled up to their chins, while the crowd presses closer. This is when the posset is brought forward, a special drink made from hot milk curdled with wine or ale, sweetened with sugar if the family can afford it, and spiced with nutmeg and cinnamon. The bride and groom must drink from the same cup, their first act of physical union witnessed by all. The posset itself carries deep meaning. The milk represents nurturing and fertility. The alcohol speaks to celebration and the dulling of inhibitions. The spices, expensive and rare, demonstrate the significance of this moment. As they sip, trying not to spill on the clean linens, the crowd offers advice, some helpful, most embarrassing, all loudly proclaimed. But the ceremonies are not yet complete. Now begins one of the most peculiar traditions, the throwing of the stockings. The bridesmaids and groomsmen divide into teams. The men take the bride's stockings, the women take the groom's. Standing at the foot of the bed with their backs turned, they throw the stockings over their shoulders, aiming for the couple's faces. If a stocking lands on the bride or groom, it's said to predict who will marry next. The game continues with increasing rowdiness, stockings flying through the air, missing their targets and hitting spectators, landing in the posset cup or getting caught in the bed curtains. All the while, the couple must lie still, enduring this bizarre bombardment with as much grace as they can muster. Throughout all of this, musicians continue to play. Their songs grow increasingly suggestive as the night wears on. Traditional wedding ballads give way to bawdy tunes that leave nothing to the imagination. The lyrics describe in metaphor, and sometimes without metaphor, exactly what is expected to happen once the crowd finally leaves. For common folk, this public bedding might take place in a single-room cottage. Imagine the scene. Perhaps 30 people crammed into a space no larger than a modern bedroom. The air becomes stifling. Bodies press against bodies. The couple on their straw mattress can reach out and touch their guests. There is quite literally nowhere to hide. Wealthier families might have a separate chamber, but this only means a larger crowd can fit. Nobles might have 50 or more witnesses to their bedding, each one there to later testify, if needed, that the marriage was properly begun. In royal weddings, ambassadors from foreign courts would attend, ready to report back to their masters that the alliance was sealed. The crowd's presence serves practical purposes beyond mere tradition. In an age before reliable documentation, witnesses were living proof that a marriage had occurred. They could testify that both parties entered the bed willingly, or at least without obvious resistance. They could confirm that no last-minute substitutions had been made, a real concern when marriages involved people who had never met before that day. Some chronicles describe bedding ceremonies lasting hours. The crowd would settle in, continuing to drink and sing while the couple lay rigid with embarrassment. Gradually, very gradually, people would begin to drift away. First the elderly, then those with long journeys home, then parents with drowsy children. But core groups of young people, particularly the wedding party, might linger until nearly dawn. The question of when, or if, consummation should occur while witnesses remained was hotly debated. Church authorities generally insisted the crowd should depart before the physical union. But custom varied wildly by region and social class. Some communities expected certain sounds to confirm the deed was done. Others required physical evidence in the morning, the bloodied sheet that would be displayed as proof of the bride's virginity and the marriage's completion. For the bride, these public preparations carried special terrors. Beyond the embarrassment of undressing before strangers, she faced the very real possibility that her new husband was a complete stranger too. Arranged marriages meant many women met their husbands for the first time at the church door that morning. Now, hours later, she must share not just a bed but her body with this unknown man while dozens watched the prelude. The bridesmaids who undressed her were often her last line of defense. They might whisper hurried advice: how to please a man, how to endure if pleasure was impossible, how to fake the blood on the sheets if necessary. These whispered conferences happened in full view of the crowd, but were treated as semi-private, one of the few concessions to the bride's dignity. Young brides, some as young as 12 or 13, faced particular challenges. Though consummation might be delayed until they were older, they still endured the public bedding ceremony. Lying beside a husband who might be decades older while grown adults made crude jokes about their future duties. The psychological impact of such experiences can only be imagined. The groom, too, faced pressures, though of a different sort. His masculinity was on public display. Any sign of reluctance, fear, or inability would be noticed and discussed for years to come. The drinking that preceded the bedding ceremony might provide courage, but too much could lead to humiliation. The crowd watched for signs of eagerness or hesitation, ready to offer commentary on both. The role of alcohol throughout these ceremonies cannot be understated. Wine, ale, and mead flowed freely from the moment the church ceremony ended. By the time of the bedding, most participants were thoroughly intoxicated. This served to lower inhibitions, certainly, but it also provided a convenient excuse for behavior that might otherwise be considered inappropriate. Things said and done during a bedding ceremony occupied a special category, acknowledged but not quite counting as normal social interaction. The gifts brought to the bedding ceremony tell their own story. Fertility charms were common: mandrake roots, believed to ensure conception, rabbit's feet for their association with prolificity, eggs hidden under the bed for abundance. Some gifts were practical: pots of grease or oil, their purpose delicately unspoken. Others were symbolic: nuts and fruits arranged in suggestive patterns. The preparation of the bedchamber itself was an art form. Mothers and aunts would spend days getting everything ready. The mattress would be restuffed with fresh straw or, for the wealthy, feathers. Herbs would be tucked into the stuffing: vervain for love, yarrow for lasting union, dill to quell lust if the groom seemed too eager. The sheets, if the family owned them, would be washed with rose water. The entire room would be scrubbed, painted if possible, decorated with whatever greenery the season provided. Wall hangings might be changed for the occasion, replacing religious scenes with more secular themes, though nothing too suggestive. The church maintained strict oversight even in private spaces. Crucifixes remained, but might be turned to face the wall, a practice that scandalized priests but persisted nonetheless. The morning after brought its own ceremonies. The crowd would reassemble, somewhat worse for wear, to witness the display of the sheets. This moment could make or break a bride's reputation. Blood on the sheets proved her virginity and the marriage's consummation. Its absence led to whispers, accusations, and sometimes annulment. Some families, knowing the stakes, took precautions. A small vial of chicken blood hidden in the bride's effects. A pinprick to the finger at the crucial moment. These deceptions were open secrets, discussed in hushed tones but widely practiced. The appearance of propriety mattered more than its reality. The public nature of medieval marriage beds extended beyond the wedding night. In many households, the marital bed stood in the main room, perhaps curtained but never truly private. Servants, children, and visitors might sleep in the same room. The sounds of marital relations were part of the household's nightly symphony. Privacy, as we understand it, simply didn't exist. Consider the psychological impact of beginning a marriage this way. Every intimate moment preceded by public spectacle. Every private feeling exposed to communal judgment. The couple's physical relationship forever linked to that first night of performance and pressure. Some marriages never recovered from their beginnings. Others found that shared embarrassment created its own form of bonding. The tradition of public bedding ceremonies began to fade first among the upper classes. By the late medieval period, some noble families were allowing couples to retire with only a few select witnesses. The door might be closed, though listeners often remained outside. This was progress of a sort, though privacy remained a distant dream. Common folk held on to the old traditions longer. In rural areas, bedding ceremonies with full community participation continued well into the early modern period. The customs provided entertainment in lives that offered few diversions. They reinforced social bonds and hierarchies. They ensured that marriage remained a public institution rather than a private contract. The Church's relationship with bedding ceremonies was complex. Officially, priests condemned the bawdy elements, the drinking, the crude songs, the lingering presence of witnesses, but they also recognized the importance of public verification. Too many clandestine marriages had caused problems, disputes over inheritance, bigamy, questions of legitimacy. Public bedding, however distasteful, prevented larger issues. Some priests tried to reform the practice. They suggested prayers replace drinking songs. They encouraged witnesses to leave immediately after the blessing. They wrote sermons condemning those who turned sacred marriage into profane spectacle. But tradition proved stronger than theological argument. The people wanted their celebrations, their customs, their moments of communal participation in life's great transitions. Regional variations in bedding ceremonies reflected local cultures. In some parts of France, the couple was required to eat soup from the same bowl while balanced on the bed. In certain German territories, the groomsmen would saw a log in half outside the bedchamber door, the sound meant to cover any noises from within. In parts of England, shoes were thrown instead of stockings, a considerably more dangerous proposition. The Welsh had a tradition called bundling, where the couple would be sewn into the bed together, literally stitched into separate sacks to prevent premature consummation while still sharing warmth. This practice sometimes replaced the full bedding ceremony, especially in winter months when gathering a crowd was impractical. Scottish customs included the salt ceremony. Salt, precious and purifying, would be sprinkled on the couple's heads as they lay in bed. This was meant to ward off evil spirits who might interfere with conception. The salt had to be gathered from the sea, blessed by a priest, and kept in a special container until the wedding night. In Ireland, the tradition of the wedding cake began as a bedding ceremony element. Cakes, really more like bread rolls, would be broken over the bride's head as she entered the bed. The crumbs that fell were carefully gathered, believed to bring fertility if placed under other women's pillows. The mess this created in the marriage bed seemed not to concern anyone. The economics of bedding ceremonies reveal much about medieval society. Wealthy families might spend more on the bedchamber preparations than on the feast itself. Imported fabrics, rare spices for the posset, musicians hired specially for the evening. The display of wealth was as important as the ceremony itself. Poor families faced different challenges. How to maintain dignity when your wedding bed was a pile of straw in the corner of your parents' cottage. How to provide hospitality when you could barely feed yourselves. Sometimes entire communities would contribute, a neighbor lending sheets, another providing candles, everyone bringing what food they could spare. The bedding ceremony became a communal effort, reinforcing bonds of mutual obligation. The seasons affected bedding ceremonies in practical ways. Winter weddings meant crowds huddled together for warmth, the bedchamber frigid despite the press of bodies. Summer brought its own challenges. The smell of unwashed guests overwhelming in close quarters, flies drawn to the feast remnants, the couple sweating under heavy woolen blankets because lighter covering would be considered improper. Spring weddings were preferred when possible. The air mild enough for comfort, but not yet heavy with summer's humidity. Fresh flowers available for decoration. The symbolic connection to fertility and new growth. But agricultural schedules often dictated otherwise. Weddings happened when work allowed, not when conditions were ideal. The role of professional witnesses deserves mention. In some regions, specific individuals were known for their ability to properly observe and later testify about bedding ceremonies. These semi-professional witnesses, often elderly women of unimpeachable reputation, would attend wedding after wedding. They knew exactly what to watch for, what questions might arise later, what details would matter in court if the marriage was challenged. These women occupied a unique social position, respected for their knowledge, feared for their judgment, essential to the proper conduct of marriages. They might advise nervous brides, guide incompetent groomsmen through the undressing ritual, ensure the priest performed the blessing correctly. Their presence lent legitimacy to proceedings that might otherwise descend into chaos. The songs sung during bedding ceremonies were passed down through generations. Most were never written down, considered too crude for documentation, but fragments survive in court records, usually when someone complained about particularly offensive verses. These songs served multiple purposes. They provided a soundtrack to the ritual, they transmitted cultural knowledge about sexuality and marriage, and they allowed the expression of thoughts normally forbidden. One surviving example from a 1423 English court record describes a song about a key finding its lock. The metaphor was barely veiled, the lyrics growing more explicit with each verse. The bride's father had sued the singers for defamation, claiming the song implied his daughter was not virgin. The court sided with the singers. Tradition protected even the most offensive wedding songs. The consumption of aphrodisiacs before and during the bedding ceremony was common. Oysters for those near the coast. Figs and dates imported at great expense. Sparrows' brains believed to inflame passion. These foods would be conspicuously consumed by the couple during the feast, the crowd watching for signs of their effect. More concerning were the potions sometimes slipped into the posset. Herbs and compounds meant to ensure consummation even if one party was reluctant. These ranged from relatively harmless ginger and cinnamon to more dangerous preparations containing mercury or lead. The bride's mother might secretly dose the drink, hoping to overcome her daughter's fear. The groom's friends might add their own ingredients, worried about his performance. The aftermath of bedding ceremonies could last for days. The immediate family would return the next morning for the sheet inspection, but the wider community continued to discuss and analyze the event for weeks. Every detail was scrutinized. How did the bride behave during undressing? Did the groom seem eager or hesitant? Were the omens favorable? Did the stockings land properly? This communal analysis served a social function. It reinforced norms about proper behavior. It provided a framework for understanding marriage and sexuality. It allowed the community to collectively process the transition of two individuals into a married couple. The bedding ceremony was as much about the witnesses as the couple. The trauma these ceremonies could inflict was recognized even at the time. Chronicles describe brides fainting from fear, grooms fleeing the bedchamber, couples who refused to emerge for days after their wedding night. But these cases were treated as aberrations, personal failures rather than systemic problems. The institution was never questioned, only individual reactions to it. Some couples found ways to subvert the traditions while appearing to comply. Secret agreements to maintain chastity despite sharing a bed. Bribes to witnesses to leave early. Elaborate ruses to avoid the most humiliating elements. These small rebellions were dangerous. Discovery could lead to annulment, social disgrace, or worse, but they speak to the human desire for dignity even in the most undignified circumstances. The gradual evolution away from public bedding ceremonies tracked with other social changes. The rise of romantic love as a basis for marriage. The increasing emphasis on individual rather than communal rights. The Protestant Reformation's challenge to traditional Catholic rituals. Each shift chipped away at the practice until it became first optional, then unusual, and finally unthinkable. Yet echoes remain even today. The tradition of carrying the bride over the threshold recalls the procession to the bedchamber. Throwing rice or petals stems from the throwing of stockings. The wedding night itself retains a cultural significance far beyond its practical purpose. We've privatized what was once public, but the weight of tradition lingers. As this first segment draws to a close, consider what we've explored. A world where privacy was neither expected nor particularly desired. Where community validation mattered more than personal comfort. Where the most intimate human experiences were transformed into public spectacle. The medieval wedding night was many things. It was never, ever truly yours alone. The candles in that crowded bedchamber have long since burned out. The witnesses have been dead for centuries, but their world reveals much about our own. About what we've gained in privacy and dignity. About what we've perhaps lost in community connection. About the eternal tension between individual desire and social expectation. As we transition from the crowded bedchambers of medieval marriages, we turn to a singular story that illuminates the darker realities of power and sexuality in the medieval world. The tale of Gerald of Aurillac, born around 855 in the castle of Aurillac in southern France, presents us with a paradox that would seem impossible by modern standards. A man who nearly committed sexual assault, yet became venerated as a saint precisely because he didn't complete the act. Gerald's story, recorded by Abbot Odo of Cluny just decades after his death, provides a window into the casual violence that characterized relationships between the nobility and their subjects, particularly when it came to matters of desire and domination. What makes Gerald's tale so revealing is not its uniqueness, but rather how ordinary his initial impulses were considered to be, and how extraordinary his resistance to them seemed to his contemporaries. Picture the Auvergne region of France in the late 9th century. Rolling hills dotted with fortified manor houses. Vast estates worked by serfs who were tied to the land as surely as the trees that grew upon it. This was Gerald's inheritance, a world where his word was quite literally law for hundreds of families who worked his fields, tended his animals, and existed entirely at his pleasure. Gerald's father, also named Gerald, was Lord of Aurillac. His mother, Adaltrud, came from an equally noble family. Young Gerald was raised with all the privileges his status afforded, trained in arms though he would prove too sickly for warfare, educated in letters, unusual for a warrior nobility that often prided itself on illiteracy, groomed from birth to exercise absolute authority over his human property. The biographical accounts describe Gerald as a young man of unusual intelligence and sensitivity. He suffered from recurring illnesses that kept him from the rough sports and military training that occupied most noble youth. Instead, he spent time reading, particularly religious texts, and managing his father's estates. This combination of power, education, and physical weakness would create the conditions for the defining moment of his spiritual life. It was during one of his regular tours of his estates that Gerald first saw her. The chronicles don't record her name, referring to her only as a beautiful serf girl. She was washing linen by a stream, a common sight that should have passed without notice. But something about her caught Gerald's attention. Perhaps it was the way the morning light caught in her hair. Perhaps the grace of her movements as she worked. Perhaps simply that she was there, and she was his to take if he wished. In the medieval understanding of social hierarchy, this young woman existed in a category barely above livestock. She was property, bound to Gerald's land, unable to leave without permission, unable to marry without his consent, unable to refuse almost any demand he might make. Her body, like her labor, belonged to the lord of the manor. This wasn't merely custom. It was enshrined in law and reinforced by centuries of tradition. Gerald's desire for this serf woman would have surprised no one. Noble men routinely took sexual advantage of the women under their power. It was so common as to be unremarkable. The children born from such unions might be acknowledged as bastards if the lord was feeling generous, or simply absorbed into the serf population if he wasn't. The women had no recourse, no protection, no voice to protest. What the chronicles tell us next requires careful consideration. Gerald, inflamed with desire, made preparations to have the girl brought to him. He didn't act on sudden impulse but planned the encounter. This premeditation speaks to how normalized such behavior was. There was no sneaking around, no concern for discovery. Why would there be? He was simply exercising a privilege of his rank. The accounts vary slightly in their details, but the general narrative remains consistent. Gerald arranged for the girl to be brought to his chambers one evening. Some versions say he had her washed and dressed in finer clothes first. Others suggest he summoned her directly from her work. All agree that she came because she had no choice. To refuse a direct order from the Lord meant punishment not just for herself but potentially for her entire family. Imagine this young woman's terror as she was escorted to the manor house. She would have known exactly why she had been summoned. Every serf woman lived with this possibility hanging over her. She might have heard stories from others who had endured similar summons. Some lords were quick and dismissive. Others took their time, drawing out the encounter. Some were violent. Others pretended to kindness. None offered genuine choice. As she entered Gerald's chambers, the power imbalance could not have been more absolute. He was nobility, she was property. He was educated, she was likely illiterate. He commanded armed men, she had only the clothes on her back. He could destroy her family with a word, she couldn't even speak against him without risking death. This was not seduction. It was predation dressed in the finery of feudal privilege. But then, according to the hagiographical accounts, something miraculous occurred. As Gerald looked upon the young woman in his chambers, his perception suddenly shifted. Where moments before he had seen an object of desire, he now saw, and this is where the accounts become deliberately vague, something that filled him with sudden shame and horror at his intentions. Some versions of the story claim that God struck Gerald with temporary blindness. Others say the girl's appearance was transformed, becoming hideous or terrifying to his eyes. Still others suggest that Gerald suddenly saw a vision of the Virgin Mary superimposed over the serf woman. The exact nature of the miracle matters less than its effect. Gerald was stopped cold in his intentions. The transformation in Gerald was immediate and profound. He fell to his knees, not before the terrified girl, but before the invisible presence he felt in the room. He began to weep, overwhelmed by the recognition of what he had been about to do. Not the legal crime. There was no crime in a lord taking a serf woman, but the spiritual one, the violation of another soul, created in God's image regardless of social station. Gerald immediately sent the girl away, untouched and likely bewildered by this unexpected reprieve. But he went further. He sought her out the next day, not for another attempt but to apologize. This alone was extraordinary. A nobleman apologizing to a serf was almost unheard of. It violated the entire social order that kept the medieval world functioning. More remarkably still, Gerald arranged for the girl's marriage to a free man of her choosing, providing a dowry from his own wealth. He elevated her from property to person with a single gesture, acknowledging her humanity in a way that challenged every assumption of his class. The chronicles present this as evidence of Gerald's holiness, but we might also read it as a recognition of how unusual such basic human decency was. This encounter became the catalyst for Gerald's complete spiritual transformation. He began to see the serfs on his estates not as property but as souls in his care. He reformed the administration of justice on his lands, forbidding his officers from using excessive force. He established fixed rents rather than arbitrary seizures. He created what contemporaries considered scandalously lenient conditions for his workers. Gerald's newfound spirituality extended beyond his treatment of serfs. He began wearing a hair shirt beneath his noble garments, a painful garment of rough cloth meant to mortify the flesh. He fasted regularly, ate simple foods even at banquets, and spent hours in prayer. Yet he remained a layman, never taking religious vows, continuing to administer his estates, but with a radically different philosophy. The biography written by Odo of Cluny presents these changes as divinely inspired, but we can also read them through a more historical lens. Gerald had confronted the reality of his own capacity for evil and been horrified by it. The near rape had shown him how easily power corrupts, how quickly desire becomes domination when there are no checks on authority. His reformation was as much psychological as spiritual. What makes Gerald's story so valuable for understanding medieval sexuality and power is how it illuminates the normal through the exceptional. Every aspect of his initial desire and planned assault was typical. It was his resistance that was miraculous. This tells us volumes about what usually happened in such situations. How many nameless serf women endured what Gerald's victim escaped? Consider the broader context of sexual violence in medieval society. The law codes of the period reveal a complex but thoroughly unequal system. Rape of a noblewoman was a serious crime, punishable by death or mutilation. Rape of a free common woman might result in fines paid to her father or husband. Rape of a serf woman by her lord wasn't legally recognized as rape at all. She was property being used by her owner. The Church's position on such matters was conflicted and often contradictory. Officially, all sexual activity outside marriage was sinful, but the Church also reinforced the social hierarchy that made such abuse possible. Priests might condemn lordly excess in sermons while accepting donations from the same lords who routinely violated their servants. The institution was too embedded in feudal power structures to effectively challenge them. Gerald's transformation included a complete rejection of sexual activity. He took a private vow of chastity, unusual for a layman and especially unusual for a nobleman expected to produce heirs. This decision created significant problems. His family pressured him to marry and continue the bloodline. Political alliances that might have been sealed through marriage were impossible. Yet Gerald persisted in his celibacy until his death. The ascetic practices Gerald adopted were extreme even by medieval standards. Beyond the hair shirt, he allegedly slept on bare boards rather than a proper bed. He limited himself to 1 meal a day during Lent. He gave away so much of his wealth to the poor that his family worried he would impoverish the estate. These behaviors, presented as holy in the hagiography, also suggest someone attempting to atone for a profound sense of guilt. Gerald's treatment of women after his conversion was notably different from the norm. He established special protections for women on his estates, particularly widows and orphans who were especially vulnerable to exploitation. He funded dowries for poor girls, enabling them to marry rather than face prostitution or servitude. He insisted his male servants and soldiers treat all women with respect, regardless of social station. But we must be careful not to overstate Gerald's progressivism. He remained a feudal lord, maintaining the fundamental structures of oppression even as he softened their edges. The serfs on his estates were still unfree, still bound to the land, still subject to his authority. His kindness was remarkable precisely because he could have been cruel with impunity. The system that enabled abuse remained intact. The miracles attributed to Gerald during his lifetime often involved protecting women from sexual violence. One story tells of a noble widow who sought his protection from a neighboring lord who wanted to force her into marriage. Gerald supposedly made the aggressor's horse refuse to carry him toward the widow's lands. Another tale describes him sheltering a young woman whose father wanted to sell her into prostitution to pay debts. These miracle stories, whether based in fact or pious fiction, reveal what medieval people saw as requiring divine intervention. The casual sexual exploitation of women was so normal that preventing it seemed supernatural. Gerald's reputation as a protector of female virtue was built on actions that should have been basic human decency, but were instead seen as saintly. After Gerald's death in 909, the stories of his life began to spread throughout southern France. Pilgrims came to his tomb seeking healing and protection. Women in particular sought his intercession, praying to him for deliverance from violent husbands, rapacious lords, and unwanted suitors. The Almost-Rapist had become, in death, a defender against rape. The cult of Saint Gerald grew rapidly. By 920, just 11 years after his death, a monastery had been established at Aurillac to tend his shrine. Odo of Cluny wrote his official biography around 930, carefully crafting the narrative to emphasize Gerald's transformation while acknowledging his initial sin. This honesty was unusual. Most hagiographies glossed over their subjects' pre-conversion failings. The process of Gerald's canonization reveals much about medieval attitudes toward sexual violence and redemption. The Church celebrated not that he had never felt violent desire, but that he had overcome it. His near crime became proof of his holiness. This paradox, that attempted rape could be a step toward sainthood, speaks to how normalized such violence was. Other nobles who heard Gerald's story often missed what modern readers might consider the point. They saw his celibacy and asceticism as the remarkable elements, not his treatment of serfs. Some attempted to imitate his piety while continuing to abuse their power in other ways. They wore hair shirts while extracting crushing rents. They fasted while their serfs starved. They prayed for salvation while perpetuating systemic oppression. The economic implications of Gerald's reforms on his estates were significant. By treating his workers more humanely, he likely increased productivity. Serfs who weren't constantly fearful of arbitrary violence worked more efficiently. Women who weren't subject to sexual predation could focus on their assigned tasks. His estates prospered even as he gave away much of his personal wealth. This economic success created an interesting tension in how his story was received. Other lords could see the practical benefits of Gerald's approach, but adopting it would mean abandoning privileges they considered fundamental to their identity. The idea that treating serfs well might be both morally right and economically advantageous was revolutionary and threatening. Gerald's influence extended through the network of religious institutions he supported. He founded several churches and monasteries, each carrying forward his unusual combination of traditional piety and social reform. These institutions provided sanctuary for women fleeing abuse, shelter for the poor, and education for selected serf children. They were islands of relative humanity in an ocean of feudal oppression. The theological implications of Gerald's story challenged certain medieval assumptions about sin and salvation. Traditional teaching held that nobility were inherently more virtuous than commoners, their high birth reflecting divine favor. But Gerald's near sin and subsequent transformation suggested that nobility could be uniquely corrupted by power, requiring special grace to overcome their privileged position's temptations. Later medieval writers struggled with Gerald's example. Some tried to emphasize his noble birth and minimize his social reforms. Others focused on his miracles while glossing over their context. The tension between celebrating a saint and acknowledging the systemic violence he opposed was never fully resolved. Each generation reinterpreted Gerald to fit their own understanding of sanctity and social order. The gender dynamics in Gerald's story deserve particular attention. The unnamed serf woman who nearly became his victim disappears from the narrative after her marriage. We know nothing of her thoughts, her trauma, her life after this encounter with arbitrary power. Her voice is entirely absent, her experience filtered through male chroniclers writing for male audiences about male holiness. This erasure is typical of medieval sources, but particularly poignant here. The woman whose near rape sparked Gerald's conversion becomes merely a prop in his spiritual journey. Her suffering, her fear, her relief at escape, none of it matters to the chroniclers except as it relates to Gerald's transformation. She exists in the historical record only as an object that briefly intersected with a great man's story. Yet we can attempt to imagine her perspective. The terror of that summons to the Lord's chamber. The walk through the manor house, perhaps past leering guards who knew why she was there. The moment of entering Gerald's room, seeing his desire, knowing what was coming. Then the confusion of his sudden change, the disorientation of unexpected reprieve. Did she feel relief? Gratitude? Anger that she had been placed in such a position at all? The arranged marriage Gerald provided might have been its own complex experience. Was the husband kind, or did he resent marrying a woman who had been in the Lord's chambers, even if untouched? Did she have to explain repeatedly that nothing had happened? Did anyone believe her? The dowry that came with her might have made her desirable as a wife, but it also marked her as connected to a strange event that challenged social norms. Gerald's story also illuminates the role of masculine sexuality in medieval noble culture. Young noblemen were expected to be sexually aggressive, to take what they wanted, to demonstrate their virility through conquest. Gerald's celibacy wasn't just a personal choice. It was a rejection of fundamental aspects of noble masculine identity. This made him seem either especially holy or particularly suspect, depending on the observer. The medical understanding of sexuality in Gerald's time added another layer to his story. Medieval medicine, following ancient Greek theories, held that sexual desire was a natural force that required release for health. Complete celibacy was thought to cause various ailments: madness, melancholy, physical weakness. Gerald's chronic illnesses were likely seen by some as consequences of his unnatural abstinence. The political ramifications of Gerald's behavior extended beyond his own estates. Other lords in the region had to contend with serfs who knew that different treatment was possible. "Lord Gerald doesn't beat his workers," they might whisper. "Lord Gerald provides dowries for poor girls. Lord Gerald's serfs eat every day." These comparisons created tensions, subtle pressures for reform that most nobles resented deeply. The Church's use of Gerald's story evolved over centuries. During periods of reform, he was held up as an example of lay piety and social justice. During more conservative eras, his mystical experiences and miracles were emphasized over his social reforms. The same saint could be invoked to support radically different visions of Christian society depending on which aspects of his life were highlighted. The architectural legacy of Gerald's foundations provides physical evidence of his impact. The monastery at Aurillac became a major center of learning and pilgrimage. Its scriptoriums produced illuminated manuscripts that spread throughout Europe. Its schools educated generations of clergy who carried forward at least some of Gerald's social consciousness. The buildings themselves, constructed with unusual attention to comfort for common pilgrims, reflected his democratic spiritual vision. Economic historians studying the period note interesting patterns in regions influenced by Geraldine monasticism. These areas often showed lower levels of serf uprising, higher agricultural productivity, and more stable population growth. While correlation doesn't prove causation, it suggests that Gerald's more humane approach to feudal lordship had practical benefits that extended beyond moral considerations. The artistic depictions of Saint Gerald reveal changing attitudes over time. Early images show him as a warrior saint, emphasizing his noble birth and downplaying his social reforms. Later medieval art depicts him distributing alms to the poor or protecting women from assault. Post-medieval representations often focus on his mystical experiences, showing him in ecstatic prayer or receiving divine visions. The feast day of Saint Gerald, October 13th, became particularly important for agricultural workers in southern France. It marked a traditional pause in the harvest season, a day when even serfs could rest from their labors. The celebrations often included role reversals, with servants briefly served by their masters, a ritualized reminder of Gerald's disruption of social hierarchies. The influence of Gerald's story on later reform movements within the Church is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. The Cluniac reforms that began at the monastery founded to tend his shrine emphasized many of his concerns: care for the poor, protection of the vulnerable, resistance to the casual violence of secular society. His example provided a model for holy men who remained engaged with the world rather than retreating from it. The survival and transmission of Gerald's story through centuries of changing social conditions speaks to its fundamental power. Here was a narrative that acknowledged the worst impulses of power while insisting that transformation was possible. It didn't excuse or minimize sexual violence, but used it as the starting point for a journey toward genuine holiness. This honesty, rare in hagiographical literature, gave the story lasting relevance. Modern historians studying Gerald must navigate between hagiography and history, between the miraculous claims and the social realities they reveal. Whether the specific miracle that stopped Gerald's assault actually occurred matters less than what the story tells us about medieval society. That such an assault was planned reveals the normalcy of sexual violence. That it was prevented seemed miraculous reveals how rare such prevention was. The psychological dimensions of Gerald's transformation invite contemporary analysis. His extreme asceticism, his complete rejection of sexuality, his obsessive charity, these could be read as symptoms of profound trauma and guilt. The near rape may have shattered his sense of self, forcing him to rebuild his identity entirely. His sainthood might have been born from what we would now recognize as a mental health crisis. The economic structures that enabled the attempted assault remained largely unchanged despite Gerald's personal transformation. Future generations of lords on his estates presumably reverted to more typical behavior. The serf women remained vulnerable, the power imbalances remained absolute, the system of exploitation continued with only temporary, localized relief. Individual sainthood couldn't overcome structural oppression. As we conclude this examination of Saint Gerald of Aurillac, we're left with profound questions about power, violence, and redemption. Can someone who nearly committed sexual assault become holy? What does it mean that preventing rape was seen as miraculous rather than normal? How do we honor the unnamed woman whose trauma became the catalyst for another's salvation? These questions echo across centuries, remaining disturbingly relevant. Gerald's story forces us to confront the casual violence that underpinned medieval society, particularly violence against women, especially women without power or protection. It shows us a world where basic human decency was so rare it seemed divine, where choosing not to rape someone could be the first step toward sainthood, where the powerful were so accustomed to taking what they wanted that restraint required supernatural intervention. The legacy of Saint Gerald of Aurillac isn't comfortable or simple. He was simultaneously perpetrator and protector, sinner and saint, reformer and lord. His story reveals the complexities of medieval sexuality, the horrors of unchecked power, and the possibility, however rare, of genuine transformation. In the flickering candlelight of medieval France, between the manor house and the serf's cottage, between desire and restraint, between power and mercy, Gerald found his unlikely path to holiness. As we drift deeper into the shadows of medieval power and sexuality, we encounter one of history's most debated and disturbing claims, the supposed right of feudal lords to take the virginity of their serfs' brides, a practice known by many names: Prima Nocta, meaning first night in Latin, droit du seigneur in French, the lord's right, or most chillingly, just primi noctis, the law of the first night. This alleged custom has haunted our collective imagination of the Middle Ages for centuries, appearing in literature, film, and popular culture as the ultimate symbol of feudal oppression. But when historians attempt to trace this practice through the documentary evidence, they find themselves in a labyrinth of rumors, propaganda, and legal fragments that may or may not describe reality. The question remains, was Prima Nocta a widespread horror of medieval life, a rare abuse of power, or perhaps a dark legend that grew larger in the telling than it ever was in practice? To understand this mystery, we must first immerse ourselves in the power structures that would have made such a practice possible. Picture a medieval manor in the year 1300. The lord controls not just the land but every aspect of his serfs' lives. They cannot leave without permission, cannot marry without his consent, cannot grind their grain anywhere but his mill, for which they pay dearly. Their bodies, their labor, their very existence belongs to him in ways that modern minds struggle to fully comprehend. The legal framework of medieval serfdom created conditions where Prima Nocta, whether formal or informal, would have been difficult to resist. A serf woman had no legal standing to refuse her lord. Her father or husband, also serfs, had no power to protect her. The lord controlled the local courts, commanded armed men and could destroy an entire family with a word. In such circumstances, the distinction between a formal right and informal coercion becomes almost meaningless. The earliest references to something resembling prima nocta appear not in legal documents but in literature and chronicles, often written centuries after the events they describe. The Epic of Gilgamesh, from ancient Mesopotamia, describes the hero king taking brides before their husbands. But this is myth, not history, and the practice is presented as tyrannical even in that ancient context. Moving forward in time, we find scattered references in medieval sources that might, or might not, refer to prima nocta. A 13th century French poem mentions lords who take their pleasure with peasant brides. A German chronicle from 1350 describes fees paid to avoid the lord's embrace. An Italian legal text discusses compensation for dishonor on wedding nights. But these fragments are frustratingly vague. Do they describe actual rape, symbolic ceremonies, or financial extortion dressed in sexual terms? The most concrete evidence comes from legal documents attempting to abolish or regulate the practice, which raises the question, why ban something that doesn't exist? In 1486, Ferdinand II of Aragon issued a decree known as the Sentencia Arbitral de Guadalupe, which explicitly forbade Catalan lords from spending the first night with their vassals' brides. The language is unambiguous. This practice, or at least the claim to it, was real enough to require royal intervention. The text of Ferdinand's decree is worth examining closely. It states that lords had claimed the right to sleep the first night with the woman who married a peasant, or in lieu of this, the peasant must pay a redemption. The phrase "in lieu of this" is crucial. It suggests that the actual physical claiming of brides may have been less common than the extortion of money to avoid it. The threat of rape becomes a tool of economic exploitation. Similar legal documents appear across Europe at various times. A Scottish chronicle mentions that King Malcolm III abolished the practice in the 11th century, replacing it with a tax called merchet. French customary laws from certain regions include provisions for redemption payments on wedding nights. Swiss records from the 15th century describe fees paid to lords for the virgin's honor. Each piece of evidence is ambiguous, suggesting something without quite proving it. The geographic distribution of these references is telling. They appear most frequently in areas where feudal control was strongest and serfs had the least freedom. The mountainous regions of Scotland, the Pyrenees between France and Spain, the Alpine valleys of Switzerland. These were places where lords ruled almost as petty kings, far from royal oversight, where custom mattered more than written law. Let us consider what the actual practice of prima nocta might have looked like if it existed. The wedding day arrives for a young serf couple. They have saved for months, perhaps years, to pay the various fees required: the marriage tax to the lord, the blessing fee to the priest, the grinding fee for wedding bread. Now comes the question of the redemption payment. Can they afford to pay for the bride to go to her husband untouched? Or must she first visit the manor house? The psychological terrorism of such a system extends beyond the physical act. Every serf family with daughters would live in dread of their wedding days. Every young man would know that his bride might come to him already violated by the Lord. The entire community would exist under this shadow, never knowing when or if the Lord would choose to exercise his supposed right. Some historians argue that prima nocta was primarily economic rather than sexual. Lords discovered they could extract additional fees by threatening something worse than normal taxation. The right may have been claimed but rarely exercised, existing mainly as leverage for extortion. A sort of sexual protection racket where peasants paid to avoid a threat that might or might not have been real. The French historian Alain Bourreau has extensively studied the prima nocta legend, examining hundreds of medieval documents. His conclusion is provocative. The practice, he argues, was largely a myth created in later periods to discredit the feudal system. Most references to it appear not in contemporary medieval sources, but in Renaissance and Enlightenment texts written by authors with political agendas. Bureau points to the suspicious timing of many Prima Nocta stories. They proliferate during periods of social upheaval when the old feudal order was under attack. Protestant reformers used tales of Prima Nocta to criticize Catholic feudalism. Enlightenment philosophers employed them to demonstrate the corruption of aristocracy. Romantic nationalists invoked them to justify rebellion against foreign nobles. The legends served political purposes that had little to do with historical accuracy. Yet other historians push back against this revisionist view. They argue that the absence of extensive documentation doesn't prove the practice didn't exist. Medieval lords didn't typically document their sexual crimes. Rape was endemic in medieval society, particularly rape of lower-class women by their social superiors. Why would this particular form of rape be uniquely mythical? The feminist historian Catherine MacKinnon argues that focusing on whether Prima Nocta was a formal legal right misses the point. In a system where lords routinely raped serf women without consequence, the specific timing, wedding night, or any other, matters less than the overall structure of sexual exploitation. The debate over Prima Nocta can distract from the broader reality of systematic sexual violence in feudal society. Consider the case of the monastery of Mont Saint-Michel in Normandy. Documents from the 14th century describe the abbot claiming the right to bless new brides on their wedding nights. The blessing required the bride to come alone to the monastery, to stay overnight, and to receive the abbot's spiritual guidance in private. The sexual implications are barely veiled, yet because it's described in religious terms, historians debate whether this constitutes evidence of Prima Nocta. The payment of merchet provides another window into this murky history. This was a fee serfs paid to their lords for permission to marry. Standard interpretation sees it as simple taxation, but many merchet records specify different amounts for virgins versus widows, higher fees for beautiful women, and complete exemption for women past childbearing age. These variations suggest the fee was connected to sexual value rather than simple administrative costs. In Scotland, the legend of Prima Nocta is particularly persistent. Medieval Scottish chronicles claim that the practice was widespread until abolished by Malcolm III, who replaced it with a payment system. But these chronicles were written centuries after Malcolm's reign, during periods of intense conflict with England. Stories of English lords claiming Prima Nocta over Scottish brides served nationalist purposes, making their historical accuracy suspect. The Welsh laws of Hywel, compiled in the 10th century, include intriguing provisions about a mober, a payment made when a woman married. The amount varied based on whether the woman was a virgin and whether she was marrying within or outside her social class. Some historians see this as evidence of institutionalized sexual access rights. Others argue it was simply a complex system of marriage taxation. German folklore preserves numerous tales of lords attempting to claim Prima Nocta and being thwarted through cleverness or divine intervention. In one story, a bride disguises her grandmother as herself, sending the old woman to the lord's bed. In another, a miraculous fog prevents the lord from finding the wedding cottage. These tales might preserve memory of actual resistance to a real practice, or they might be moral fables with no basis in historical events. The economic dimensions of Prima Nocta, whether real or threatened, deserve careful consideration. A lord who could credibly threaten to rape brides could extract significant payments from his serfs. These payments came on top of regular rents, labor obligations, and other fees. The accumulation of such charges could impoverish families for generations, creating cycles of debt and dependency. Let's examine one of the most detailed accounts we have, the Chronicle of the Monastery of St. Claude in the Jura Mountains. Written in the 16th century but describing earlier customs, it claims that local lords had the right to place a leg in the bed of new brides on their wedding nights. This symbolic act supposedly represented the lord's theoretical right to more, which could be avoided through payment. But was this ever more than symbolism? The Chronicle doesn't say. The role of the Church in Prima Nocta allegations is complex and contradictory. Some sources describe priests and abbots claiming similar rights over their parishioners. Others show church authorities condemning the practice as sinful and void. The Church's position seemed to depend largely on whether secular lords or church officials were the ones accused of claiming these rights. In Catalonia, where Ferdinand II's decree provides our clearest evidence, the practice was called malus, literally bad custom. The decree describes lords claiming the right to take carnal knowledge of brides or receive payment instead. But even here, in our most explicit source, questions remain. How often was the right exercised versus bought off? Was it universal or limited to certain estates? The decree abolishes the practice but doesn't describe its frequency. The anthropological perspective offers another lens through which to view Prima Nocta. Many cultures worldwide have traditions of ritual defloration, where virginity is taken by someone other than the husband. Sometimes this is a religious figure, sometimes a stranger, sometimes a social superior. These practices often serve to establish paternity uncertainty, preventing excessive focus on bloodline purity. Could Prima Nocta have originated as such a ritual before becoming a tool of oppression? The literary tradition surrounding Prima Nocta has profoundly shaped our understanding of the practice. From Voltaire to Beaumarchais to modern films like Braveheart, creative works have presented Prima Nocta as historical fact. These depictions, often more vivid than any historical source, have cemented the practice in popular imagination. The legend has become more real than whatever truth might lie beneath it. Archaeological evidence, or rather its absence, adds another dimension to the mystery. Medieval manor houses show no special chambers designated for Prima Nocta encounters. Church records of marriages don't include systematic references to the practice. Court rolls dealing with marriage disputes rarely mention it. If Prima Nocta was as widespread as legend suggests, why did it leave so few physical and documentary traces? The testimony of medieval women themselves is almost entirely absent from this debate. We have no diaries, no letters, no direct accounts from women who supposedly faced or avoided Prima Nocta. Their voices are filtered through male chroniclers, male lawyers, male historians. The people most affected by this alleged practice are silent in the historical record, their experiences interpreted by others. Regional variations in marriage customs provide context for understanding Prima Nocta claims. In some areas, symbolic bedding ceremonies involved the lord briefly sitting on the marriage bed. Elsewhere, lords gave ritual gifts to new brides. Some regions required the lord's blessing on marriages. These customs, innocent or not, could easily be misinterpreted or deliberately misrepresented as Prima Nocta. The decline of serfdom in Western Europe coincided with an increase in Prima Nocta allegations. As the feudal system weakened, stories of its worst abuses proliferated. This timing suggests that Prima Nocta legends served to justify the dismantling of feudalism, painting the old system as so corrupt that any change was improvement. The worse the past could be made to seem, the better the present appeared. Legal historians note that medieval law was incredibly complex and localized. What was custom in one valley might be unknown in the next. A practice that existed on one estate might be considered outrageous on another. This patchwork nature of medieval law means that Prima Nocta could have been real in some places while being mythical in others. Both the believers and skeptics might be right. The question of evidence standards haunts this historical debate. How much proof do we need to believe something existed? How much absence of proof do we need to believe it didn't? In a world where literacy was rare, record-keeping sporadic, and sexual violence routine, what kind of evidence would we expect to find? These methodological questions have no easy answers. The psychological impact of Prima Nocta, real or threatened, on medieval communities would have been profound. The mere possibility that such a right existed would have shaped behavior. Young women might have been married off quickly to less desirable but safer partners. Families might have saved desperately to pay redemption fees. Communities might have developed elaborate strategies to hide or protect brides. The threat alone was a form of terrorism. Comparative history offers interesting parallels. In the American antebellum South, slave owners routinely raped enslaved women without any formal right to do so. In various colonized territories, colonizers took sexual advantage of indigenous women through a combination of force and coercion. These documented practices show how sexual exploitation operates in systems of extreme inequality without requiring formal legal sanction. The economic history of marriage fees provides circumstantial evidence for the Prima Nocta debate. In regions where lords were accused of claiming first night rights, marriage fees were consistently higher than in other areas. This could suggest that redemption payments were real. Or it could simply mean that lords in those regions were more extractive in general. The correlation is suggestive but not conclusive. As we delve deeper into this historical mystery, we must consider the propagandistic uses of Prima Nocta stories. During the French Revolution, tales of aristocrats claiming first night rights inflamed popular anger. These stories, whether based in historical fact or contemporary invention, served to justify violence against the nobility. The political utility of Prima Nocta legends made their factual accuracy almost irrelevant. The scholarly consensus, if such a thing exists, seems to be that Prima Nocta as a formal, widespread legal right probably didn't exist. But informal sexual coercion by lords over their female subjects certainly did. The debate over Prima Nocta might be asking the wrong question. Instead of wondering whether lords had the legal right to rape brides, we should recognize that they had the practical power to rape any serfwoman, bride or not. The silence of medieval women in these historical debates speaks volumes about the nature of our sources. Every account we have of Prima Nocta, whether affirming or denying its existence, was written by men. Monks chronicling the sins of secular lords, lawyers documenting property transfers, nobles justifying their privileges or condemning their rivals. The women who would have been the actual victims of this practice, if it existed, left no direct testimony. This absence forces us to read between the lines of other documents. Court records occasionally mention women fleeing their home villages just before marriage. Were they escaping Prima Nocta, or simply arranged marriages they found distasteful? Monastery records show unusual numbers of young women seeking sanctuary in certain regions. Was this religious devotion or desperation for protection? The patterns suggest something, but what exactly remains frustratingly unclear. The transformation of Prima Nocta from possible reality to definite legend occurred gradually over centuries. By the Renaissance, writers were describing it as an ancient barbarity that enlightened times had overcome. By the Enlightenment, philosophers like Voltaire were using it as a symbol of everything wrong with feudalism. By the Romantic era, it had become a staple of Gothic fiction, more literary device than historical claim. Consider how the legend functioned in different cultural contexts. In revolutionary France, stories of Prima Nocta justified violence against aristocrats. In nationalist Scotland, it represented English oppression. In Protestant regions, it exemplified Catholic corruption. In each case, the legend served contemporary political needs rather than historical accuracy. The story was too useful to abandon, regardless of its truth. The legal peculiarities surrounding marriage and consummation in medieval law provide important context. Marriage was both a sacrament and a contract, requiring both religious blessing and physical consummation to be complete. An unconsummated marriage could be annulled, making the question of when and how consummation occurred legally significant. This created situations where witnesses to bedding were legally necessary, which could easily be misremembered or misrepresented as Prima Nocta. The symbolic aspects of lordly participation in peasant marriages went beyond potential sexual exploitation. Lords often provided wedding feasts for their serfs, partly as generosity but also as demonstration of control. They might give the bride a gift, escort her to church, or dance with her at the celebration. These ceremonies reinforced social hierarchy while creating ambiguous situations that later generations might interpret as sexual in nature. In some regions, lords claimed the right to approve or deny marriages among their serfs. This power, while not explicitly sexual, created opportunities for coercion. A lord could refuse permission unless certain conditions were met: payments made, services rendered, favors granted. The line between economic exploitation and sexual coercion could blur, especially when young women were involved in negotiations. The medieval understanding of virginity and its value adds another layer to this discussion. Virginity was simultaneously sacred and commodified. A virgin bride brought higher bride prices and dowries. The Church celebrated virginity as holy while secular law treated it as property. In this context, a lord claiming a bride's virginity would be stealing something of both spiritual and economic value. Documentary evidence from Spain provides some of our most intriguing clues. The fueros, local law codes, of certain regions include provisions that seem to reference Prima Nocta without naming it directly. References to dishonor fees paid on wedding nights, redemption customs specific to marriages, and ancient privileges that could be bought out. These fragments suggest something, but their vagueness prevents definitive conclusions. The role of customary law versus written law in medieval society complicates our investigation. Many practices existed through tradition rather than documentation. They were known and followed without being formally recorded. Prima Nocta might have existed in this twilight zone of custom, real enough to those who lived under it, but leaving few written traces for historians to find. The testimony of foreign travelers provides another perspective. Merchants, diplomats, and pilgrims sometimes described customs they found shocking in lands they visited. A few mention wedding night practices that might be Prima Nocta, but these accounts are problematic. Travelers often misunderstood what they saw, exaggerated for effect, or reported rumors as fact. Their outsider perspective is valuable but unreliable. The intersection of Prima Nocta claims with other forms of sexual exploitation in medieval society deserves consideration. Lords who routinely raped serf women wouldn't need a special right to do so on wedding nights. The formal claim of Prima Nocta might have been less about enabling sexual violence, which already occurred freely, and more about ritualizing and legitimizing it. Archaeological evidence from medieval villages offers indirect insights. Settlement patterns show that in some regions, newlywed couples moved away from their home villages immediately after marriage. Was this normal establishment of new households or flight from lordly predation? The timing and patterns of these movements vary by region in ways that correlate suggestively with areas where Prima Nocta was later claimed to have existed. The evolution of marriage law in the late medieval period shows increasing church efforts to regulate sexual behavior. Successive councils and decrees attempted to eliminate various pagan wedding customs. Some of these eliminated customs sound suspiciously similar to Prima Nocta. Was the church abolishing a real practice or a legendary one? The documents don't make clear distinctions. The economic analysis of redemption payments reveals interesting patterns. In regions where such payments are documented, they often equaled several months of a peasant family's income. This suggests either that the threat being avoided was considered extremely serious, or that lords had discovered an extremely effective form of extortion. Either interpretation supports the idea that something real, not merely legendary, was being bought off. The comparative study of similar practices in other feudal societies worldwide provides context. In feudal Japan, certain daimyo claimed comparable rights over peasant women. In parts of Russia, boyars exercised similar privileges. In colonial contexts, similar patterns emerged. This suggests that Prima Nocta, whether formally codified or informally practiced, might be a predictable outcome of extreme power imbalances rather than a unique European aberration. The gradual transformation of the legend in popular culture tracks with changing social anxieties. Medieval writers focused on the sin and salvation aspects. Renaissance writers emphasized the barbarity of the past versus present enlightenment. Victorian writers used it to explore sexual repression and class conflict. Modern depictions often focus on resistance and rebellion. Each era reshapes the legend to reflect its own concerns. The historiographical debate over Prima Nocta reflects larger questions about how we study the past. Should historians only accept what can be definitively proven through documents? Or should they also consider what was likely given social structures and power dynamics? The Prima Nocta debate becomes a proxy for arguments about methodology, evidence, and the nature of historical truth itself. The question of why this particular legend has such staying power deserves consideration. Among all the abuses of feudalism, why has Prima Nocta captured imaginations so persistently? Perhaps because it combines sexual violence, class oppression, and abuse of power in a single visceral image. It crystallizes complex historical injustices into a simple, horrible story that feels emotionally true even if historically uncertain. The gender dynamics of historical scholarship itself influence this debate. Until recently, most historians were men, potentially less attuned to or comfortable discussing sexual violence. The increasing presence of women in historical scholarship has brought new perspectives and methodologies to questions like Prima Nocta. Different scholars see different things in the same fragmentary evidence. Regional variations in the legend's persistence map onto historical trauma in interesting ways. Areas that experienced particularly harsh feudalism or violent conquest tend to have stronger Prima Nocta traditions. This could mean the practice was real in those places, or that the legends served to process collective trauma. The stories communities tell about their past reveal as much about their present as their history. The legal reforms of the late medieval period provide indirect evidence about Prima Nocta. New laws specifically protecting women's consent in marriage, prohibiting forced marriages, and establishing penalties for sexual violence against lower-class women. Were these reforms addressing real problems or theoretical ones? The specificity of some provisions suggests actual abuses being remedied. As we near the end of this exploration, we must acknowledge that the truth about Prima Nocta may be ultimately unknowable. The evidence is too fragmentary, too ambiguous, too filtered through centuries of retelling to provide certainty. What we can say is that the legend, whether based in widespread fact, isolated incidents, or pure fiction, reveals deep truths about medieval society. The legend of Prima Nocta forces us to confront the systematic vulnerability of medieval women, particularly poor women, to sexual violence. Whether or not lords had a formal right to rape brides on their wedding nights, they clearly had the practical power to rape serf women whenever they chose. The debate over Prima Nocta shouldn't distract from this larger, undeniable reality of medieval sexual oppression. The persistence of the legend into modern times serves as a reminder of how power and sexuality intertwine. The story resonates because we recognize its dynamics, the powerful taking what they want, the powerless having no recourse, the system that enables abuse. These patterns aren't confined to medieval history. They echo through time in different forms but similar structures. The intersection of Prima Nocta claims with other forms of sexual exploitation in medieval society deserves consideration. Lords who routinely raped serf women wouldn't need a special right to do so on wedding nights. The formal claim of Prima Nocta might have been less about enabling sexual violence, which already occurred freely, and more about ritualizing and legitimizing it. Archaeological evidence from medieval villages offers indirect insights. Settlement patterns show that in some regions, newlywed couples moved away from their home villages immediately after marriage. Was this normal establishment of new households or flight from lordly predation? The timing and patterns of these movements vary by region in ways that correlate suggestively with areas where Prima Nocta was later claimed to have existed. The evolution of marriage law in the late medieval period shows increasing church efforts to regulate sexual behavior. Successive councils and decrees attempted to eliminate various pagan wedding customs. Some of these eliminated customs sound suspiciously similar to Prima Nocta. Was the church abolishing a real practice or a legendary one? The documents don't make clear distinctions. The economic analysis of redemption payments reveals interesting patterns. In regions where such payments are documented, they often equaled several months of a peasant family's income. This suggests either that the threat being avoided was considered extremely serious, or that lords had discovered an extremely effective form of extortion. Either interpretation supports the idea that something real, not merely legendary, was being bought off. The comparative study of similar practices in other feudal societies worldwide provides context. In feudal Japan, certain daimyo claimed comparable rights over peasant women. In parts of Russia, boyars exercised similar privileges. In colonial contexts, similar patterns emerged. This suggests that Prima Nocta, whether formally codified or informally practiced, might be a predictable outcome of extreme power imbalances rather than a unique European aberration. The gradual transformation of the legend in popular culture tracks with changing social anxieties. Medieval writers focused on the sin and salvation aspects. Renaissance writers emphasized the barbarity of the past versus present enlightenment. Victorian writers used it to explore sexual repression and class conflict. Modern depictions often focus on resistance and rebellion. Each era reshapes the legend to reflect its own concerns. The historiographical debate over Prima Nocta reflects larger questions about how we study the past. Should historians only accept what can be definitively proven through documents? Or should they also consider what was likely given social structures and power dynamics? The Prima Nocta debate becomes a proxy for arguments about methodology, evidence, and the nature of historical truth itself. The question of why this particular legend has such staying power deserves consideration. Among all the abuses of feudalism, why has Prima Nocta captured imaginations so persistently? Perhaps because it combines sexual violence, class oppression, and abuse of power in a single visceral image. It crystallizes complex historical injustices into a simple, horrible story that feels emotionally true even if historically uncertain. The gender dynamics of historical scholarship itself influence this debate. Until recently, most historians were men, potentially less attuned to or comfortable discussing sexual violence. The increasing presence of women in historical scholarship has brought new perspectives and methodologies to questions like Prima Nocta. Different scholars see different things in the same fragmentary evidence. Regional variations in the legend's persistence map onto historical trauma in interesting ways. Areas that experienced particularly harsh feudalism or violent conquest tend to have stronger Prima Nocta traditions. This could mean the practice was real in those places, or that the legends served to process collective trauma. The stories communities tell about their past reveal as much about their present as their history. The legal reforms of the late medieval period provide indirect evidence about Prima Nocta. New laws specifically protecting women's consent in marriage, prohibiting forced marriages, and establishing penalties for sexual violence against lower-class women. Were these reforms addressing real problems or theoretical ones? The specificity of some provisions suggests actual abuses being remedied. As we near the end of this exploration, we must acknowledge that the truth about Prima Nocta may be ultimately unknowable. The evidence is too fragmentary, too ambiguous, too filtered through centuries of retelling to provide certainty. What we can say is that the legend, whether based in widespread fact, isolated incidents, or pure fiction, reveals deep truths about medieval society. The legend of Prima Nocta forces us to confront the systematic vulnerability of medieval women, particularly poor women, to sexual violence. Whether or not lords had a formal right to rape brides on their wedding nights, they clearly had the practical power to rape serf women whenever they chose. The debate over Prima Nocta shouldn't distract from this larger, undeniable reality of medieval sexual oppression. The persistence of the legend into modern times serves as a reminder of how power and sexuality intertwine. The story resonates because we recognize its dynamics, the powerful taking what they want, the powerless having no recourse, the system that enables abuse. These patterns aren't confined to medieval history. They echo through time in different forms but similar structures. As we transition from the shadows of Prima Nocta into the broader landscape of medieval marriage customs, we discover that the public nature of wedding nights existed across all levels of society, but the form, meaning, and experience of these rituals varied dramatically based on one's position in the social hierarchy. From the golden beds of royalty to the straw pallets of serfs, every marriage began with witnesses, but what they witnessed and why reveals the profound inequalities that structured medieval life. Let us begin in the perfumed chambers of a royal palace, perhaps in Paris in the year 1385, where the 14-year-old Isabella of Bavaria married Charles VI of France. The bedchamber has been prepared for weeks. Tapestries depicting appropriate biblical scenes. The marriage of Sarah and Tobias was particularly favored, hang from every wall. The bed itself, raised on a platform and surrounded by curtains of silk from Byzantium, cost more than a peasant village would produce in a lifetime. The royal bedding ceremony was state theater of the highest order. Every detail choreographed, every gesture weighted with political significance. The young princess, barely past childhood, was undressed by the highest-ranking duchesses in the realm. Each piece of her clothing was removed according to strict protocol, first the outer robes by one duchess, then the girdle by another, each action accompanied by specific prayers and blessings. The Bishop of Paris himself stood ready with his golden aspergillum, sprinkling holy water that had been specially blessed for this occasion, not ordinary holy water, but water mixed with salt from the Holy Land, myrrh from Arabia, and gold dust. Yes, actual gold dust, to ensure the most powerful blessing possible. He circled the bed 7 times, once for each day of creation, intoning prayers in Latin that called upon every saint associated with marriage and fertility. Meanwhile, the young king was being prepared in an adjacent chamber by his noble companions. His disrobing was equally ceremonial, but with a different character. Where the princess's undressing emphasized purity and submission, the king's emphasized virility and dominance. His friends made ribald jokes, but carefully scripted ones, nothing too crude for the ecclesiastical witnesses, but enough to assert his masculine readiness for the task ahead. The convergence of the couple in the marriage bed was witnessed by carefully selected observers, not the drunken crowd of a common wedding, but ambassadors from allied kingdoms, papal representatives, the highest nobles of France. Each witness served a specific diplomatic purpose. The Venetian ambassador would report to his Senate that the French succession was secure. The papal legate would confirm to Rome that the marriage was canonically valid. The Duke of Burgundy would assess whether this union threatened his own political ambitions. The bed itself had been constructed specifically for this occasion. The mattress stuffed with swan feathers and rose petals. The sheets, woven from Egyptian cotton and embroidered with the combined arms of France and Bavaria, took a team of nuns 3 years to complete. The pillows contained herbs selected by the court physician, mandrake for fertility, of course, but also valerian for calm and jasmine for desire. Every element designed to facilitate not just consummation but successful conception. The couple lay side by side as prayers were said over them, not the brief blessing a village priest might mumble, but an hour-long liturgical ceremony. Psalms were sung by a choir of young boys chosen for their angelic voices. Incense filled the air, so thick it made eyes water. The archbishop delivered a sermon on the duties of Christian marriage, carefully balancing the need for procreation with warnings against excessive lust even within marriage. The question of when witnesses should withdraw was precisely regulated in royal weddings. They remained for the blessing, for the ceremonial closing of the bed curtains, sometimes even for prayers said after the curtains were closed. But for royalty, unlike common folk, there was usually a moment when privacy was granted, or at least its approximation. Guards might stand outside the door, ladies-in-waiting might remain in the antechamber, but the act itself was generally not directly observed. However, the morning brought renewed scrutiny. The bloodied sheets would be displayed not just to family but to the entire court. Heralds would proclaim that the marriage had been consummated. In some cases, particularly where succession was disputed or the bride's virginity had been questioned, midwives would conduct intimate examinations to confirm that consummation had occurred. These findings would be recorded in official documents, sealed with wax, and preserved in royal archives. The political implications of royal bedding ceremonies extended far beyond the couple involved. A successfully consummated royal marriage could secure peace between warring kingdoms. A failure to consummate could trigger wars. When Louis XVI of France failed to consummate his marriage to Marie Antoinette for 7 years, it became an international crisis, with ambassadors writing frantic dispatches and physicians being consulted from across Europe. Consider the extraordinary case of Margaret of Anjou and Henry VI of England in 1445. The king, known for his piety and possible mental illness, reportedly refused to consummate the marriage for years. The political chaos this created, questions about succession, rumors about the king's capacity, whispers about the queen's virtue, contributed to the Wars of the Roses. The bedroom became a battlefield where dynasties rose and fell. Royal couples often had to perform their marital duties under extraordinary pressure. They knew that failure to produce an heir quickly could lead to annulment, war, or assassination. Young princesses, some barely past their first menstruation, were expected to conceive immediately and repeatedly. The pressure was so intense that court physicians developed elaborate fertility treatments, from special diets to specific positions guaranteed to produce male heirs. The contrast with peasant marriage beds could not be more stark. Picture now a one-room cottage in the same year, 1385, somewhere in the English countryside. The entire dwelling is perhaps 12 feet by 15 feet. The walls are wattle and daub, the roof thatch, the floor beaten earth covered with rushes that haven't been changed in months. In one corner, chickens roost. In another, the family pig lies grunting. And in the center, the family's single bed. This bed, if it can be called that, is a wooden frame filled with straw, perhaps softened with a bit of heather if the family was lucky enough to gather some. The entire extended family sleeps here. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents, occasionally even valued livestock in winter. Privacy is not just absent but inconceivable. Every sound, every movement, every bodily function is shared knowledge. When a peasant couple married, their wedding night took place in this cramped, communal space. The younger children might be sent to sleep with neighbors, if the neighbors had room, but often they simply huddled in the corners, instructed to keep their faces to the wall. The parents of the bride or groom might lie just feet away, offering advice, criticism, or encouragement as they deemed necessary. The role of the village wise woman in peasant beddings was complex and often intrusive. These elderly women, repositories of folk knowledge about fertility and sexuality, would often remain in the cottage for several nights after the wedding. They would instruct the bride on how to position herself, when to be receptive, what to do if her husband was too rough or too gentle. Their presence was considered essential for ensuring the marriage started properly. These wise women brought with them an arsenal of folk remedies and superstitions. They might place fertility charms under the bed, a hare's foot, a mandrake root, or if those were too expensive, simply some wheat stalks tied with red thread. They would prepare special drinks for the couple, herbs mixed with ale that were supposed to increase desire and ensure conception. Some of these concoctions were harmless, others potentially dangerous, containing plants we now know to be toxic. The economic realities of peasant life meant that marriage often couldn't wait for ideal circumstances. Couples might marry in winter when agricultural work was lighter, even though it meant consummating their marriage in a freezing cottage. They might marry during harvest when the community could contribute food for a feast, even though exhaustion from field work left little energy for romance. The rhythms of survival trumped personal preference. The lack of privacy in peasant marriages extended far beyond the wedding night. Every aspect of married life was communally observed. Neighbors knew when couples fought, when they made love, when menstruation began and ended. In such close quarters, the entire village effectively participated in each marriage. This could provide support and protection, but also suffocating scrutiny and judgment. The contrast in material culture between noble and peasant beddings is staggering. A royal bride might wear undergarments of silk so fine they were nearly transparent, perfumed with oils from the Orient. A peasant bride wore the same rough linen shift she had worn for months, perhaps washed for the occasion if water wasn't too scarce. A noble couple drank honeyed wine from golden goblets. Peasants shared ale from a wooden bowl if they had ale at all. The religious experience also differed dramatically by class. While royal weddings involved multiple bishops, holy relics, and elaborate liturgies, peasant weddings might have only a brief blessing from an overworked parish priest, if he was sober and available. Some rural communities went months without seeing a priest, conducting their own marriage ceremonies that the church later had to retroactively validate. The merchant and artisan classes occupied a middle ground in wedding night customs. A successful merchant in London or Florence might have a proper bedchamber, separate from the main living areas. The bed would have real sheets, perhaps even a feather mattress. The blessing might be performed by a respected priest rather than a bishop, but not the barely literate rural clergy. Witnesses would be present but fewer in number and better behaved than at peasant weddings. Guild regulations sometimes specified wedding protocols for their members. The Goldsmiths' Guild of Paris, for instance, required that master craftsmen provide separate sleeping quarters for apprentices on their wedding nights. The Bakers' Guild of London mandated that members contribute bread for wedding feasts, ensuring no guild member's marriage lacked proper celebration. These regulations reveal how important proper marriage ceremonies were for maintaining social status. The gendered experience of bedding ceremonies varied significantly by class. Noble women, while subjected to elaborate public rituals, generally had some protection from the worst excesses. Their high status and the political importance of their bodies meant that outright abuse could have diplomatic consequences. Peasant women had no such protection. Their wedding nights were witnessed by people they would see every day for the rest of their lives, people who might joke crudely about what they had observed for decades to come. The role of virginity and its proof differed by social status as well. For royalty, virginity was a matter of international diplomacy. Princesses were often examined by midwives before marriage to certify their intact state. For peasants, virginity was more assumed than proven. The bloodied sheets might be displayed, but in a one-room cottage where everyone had observed everyone else's bodily functions for years, there were fewer secrets and perhaps less emphasis on physical proof. The consumption of alcohol at different social levels created different dynamics. Royal wedding feasts featured the finest wines, carefully measured consumption, and relatively controlled behavior, at least in theory. Peasant weddings involved vast quantities of cheap ale, often home-brewed and of uncertain potency. The drunkenness at peasant beddings was legendary, leading to behavior that would have caused international incidents at royal weddings. The seasonal variations affected different classes differently. Royalty could afford to heat their chambers, light them with hundreds of candles, and create artificial comfort regardless of the season. Peasants married according to the agricultural calendar and suffered or enjoyed the weather accordingly. A January wedding meant shivering through the bedding ceremony. A July wedding meant sweltering in close quarters with unwashed bodies. The role of families in arranging and witnessing marriages varied by class in telling ways. Royal marriages were negotiated by diplomats and lawyers, sometimes taking years to arrange. The bride and groom might meet for the first time at the altar. Peasant marriages, while also often arranged, involved families who knew each other intimately. The couple had likely grown up together, worked the same fields, attended the same village festivals. Their wedding night held fewer surprises, but perhaps more genuine emotion. The medical attention available to different classes created vastly different experiences. Royal physicians prepared elaborate treatments to ensure successful consummation and conception. They prescribed specific diets, favorable astrological timings, and complex herbal preparations. Peasants relied on folk wisdom passed down through generations, much of it ineffective or actively harmful. A royal bride who failed to conceive would receive the best medical care available. A peasant woman might die from a botched folk remedy. The legal implications of consummation varied dramatically by social status. For royalty, failure to consummate could trigger international crises, wars, and succession disputes that would echo through centuries. For peasants, an unconsummated marriage might be quietly annulled by the local priest, the couple separating and remarrying with little fanfare. The stakes were inversely proportional to the couple's actual power over their situation. The role of witnesses in validating marriages served different purposes at different social levels. Royal witnesses were political actors, their testimony potentially shaping the fate of nations. Peasant witnesses were community members whose testimony maintained local social order. Both were essential for their respective contexts, but the nature and consequences of their witnessing differed profoundly. The decorations and preparations for bedding ceremonies reflected economic disparities in stark ways. A royal bedchamber might be renovated entirely for a wedding, with new tapestries, furniture, and even architectural modifications. A peasant cottage might receive a fresh layer of rushes on the floor, and perhaps some wildflowers if they were in season. Yet both represented significant investments relative to the family's resources. The role of music and entertainment during bedding ceremonies varied by class. Royal weddings featured professional musicians, composed pieces, and carefully orchestrated performances. Peasant weddings had local fiddlers, traditional songs passed down orally, and spontaneous dancing that sometimes devolved into chaos. Both served to create atmosphere and mark the occasion as special, but the resources available created vastly different experiences. The morning after rituals also diverged significantly. Royal couples might not emerge from their chambers for days, attended by servants who brought elaborate meals and managed their every need. Peasant couples rose at dawn to return to work, their wedding night already becoming memory as they faced the harsh realities of survival. A princess might spend weeks recovering from her wedding night. A peasant woman was expected in the fields the next day. The gift-giving associated with marriages varied enormously by class. Royal weddings involved exchanges of territories, trading rights, and massive dowries that could bankrupt kingdoms. Peasant weddings might involve a few chickens, a cooking pot, or simply the promise of future labor. Yet proportionally, these gifts might represent similar sacrifices. A peasant family giving a daughter a single cow might be surrendering a larger percentage of their wealth than a king granting a province. The written records of marriages reflect class differences in documentation. Royal marriages generated hundreds of documents: contracts, correspondence, diplomatic reports, chronicle entries. Peasant marriages might appear only as a single line in a parish register, if that. This disparity in documentation means we know intimate details about royal bedding ceremonies while having to reconstruct peasant experiences from fragments and inference. The role of superstition and folklore in bedding ceremonies crossed class lines but manifested differently. Royalty might consult astrologers for auspicious dates and employ blessed objects from famous shrines. Peasants relied on local traditions like throwing shoes for luck or hanging herbs over the door. Both sought to influence fate through ritual, but their rituals reflected their different access to formal religion and education. The clothing worn during bedding ceremonies marked class distinctions in ways both obvious and subtle. Royal brides might change garments multiple times during their wedding day, each outfit worth more than a peasant family would see in generations. The night shift worn to bed would be of the finest linen, embroidered with gold thread, scented with lavender water imported from Provence. A peasant bride might own only 2 garments total, the dress she wore daily and perhaps one slightly better dress for festivals, now serving as her wedding attire. The language of bedding ceremonies also varied dramatically by class. Royal ceremonies were conducted in Latin and French, languages of power and sophistication that many participants might not fully understand. The prayers, the vows, the blessings all performed in tongues that elevated the ceremony beyond common comprehension. Peasant ceremonies used the vernacular, the everyday speech of the fields and markets, crude, direct, and understood by all. The jokes told at peasant beddings would have caused diplomatic incidents if spoken at royal ones. Consider the different ways fertility was approached across social strata. Royal couples received medical consultations from university-trained physicians who prescribed elaborate regimens based on classical texts and astrological calculations. They might be told to abstain on certain days, to assume specific positions believed to influence the sex of offspring, to consume rare and expensive substances like powdered pearls or unicorn horn, which was usually narwhal tusk. Peasant couples relied on folk wisdom that mixed practical observation with superstition, eating eggs for fertility, avoiding cold foods that might chill the womb, placing fertility charms of dubious efficacy under their straw mattresses. The presence or absence of choice in marriage partners created fundamentally different emotional landscapes for wedding nights. A royal bride might be meeting her husband for virtually the first time, having been betrothed years earlier to someone she'd never seen. The terror of sharing a bed with a stranger, compounded by the presence of witnesses, created a unique form of trauma. Peasant couples, while also often in arranged marriages, typically knew each other from childhood. They had worked the same fields, attended the same village festivals, perhaps even experimented with courtship before their families arranged the match. The legal framework surrounding consummation differed significantly by class. For royalty, failure to consummate could trigger annulment proceedings that involved papal courts and international law. Teams of lawyers might argue over whether true consent had been given, whether consummation had been properly attempted, whether physical or mental impediments existed. For peasants, these matters were handled locally by the parish priest, often resolved with little documentation or formal procedure. A peasant marriage that failed might simply dissolve back into the community with minimal legal consequence. The role of midwives and medical attendants varied enormously. Royal brides had access to the most experienced midwives in the realm, women who had attended dozens of noble births and understood the political as well as physical aspects of their role. These midwives might examine the bride before and after consummation, their testimony potentially shaping dynastic futures. Peasant women might have only the village wise woman, whose knowledge was entirely traditional and whose expertise varied wildly. Some were skilled healers who understood herbs and bodies, others were merely old women repeating what they'd been told without real understanding. The financial costs of wedding nights reflected massive economic disparities. A single royal wedding celebration might cost more than entire villages produced in a decade. The candles alone for a royal bedding ceremony, hundreds of pounds of finest beeswax, could exceed a peasant's lifetime earnings. Meanwhile, peasant families might go into debt simply to provide ale for their wedding guests, a debt that could take years to repay and affect the couple's ability to establish their own household. The duration of wedding celebrations varied dramatically by class. Royal weddings might continue for weeks, with different ceremonies, feasts, and entertainments each day. The bedding ceremony was just one event in an extended performance of power and wealth. Peasant weddings typically lasted a single day, perhaps extending into the next if the harvest had been particularly good. The community could not afford to stop working for longer, and the family could not afford to feed guests for extended periods. The role of pregnancy and childbirth following the wedding night showed stark class differences. A royal bride who conceived quickly would be attended by the finest physicians, fed the best foods, protected from any stress or strain. Her pregnancy would be a matter of state, with bulletins issued about her health and prayers said across the kingdom. A peasant woman who conceived would continue working in the fields until labor began, would deliver with minimal assistance, and would be expected back at work within days. The contrast in maternal and infant mortality rates between classes was staggering. The cultural memory of wedding nights was preserved differently across social levels. Royal weddings were recorded in chronicles, depicted in illuminated manuscripts, commemorated in songs and poems that survived centuries. Every detail of the ceremony was documented, analyzed, and mythologized. Peasant weddings left few traces, perhaps a line in a parish register, perhaps nothing at all. Entire lives, including their beginnings in marriage, vanished without record. We know intimate details about the wedding night of Isabella of Valois, but nothing about the thousands of peasant Isabellas who married the same year. The role of violence in wedding nights varied by class in complex ways. Royal brides, while protected from crude physical assault by their political value, might face subtler forms of coercion. The pressure to immediately conceive, the lack of any choice in partners, the knowledge that failure to please could mean annulment or worse. Peasant women faced more direct physical threats, but also had certain protections within their communities. Neighbors who might intervene if screams were too loud, families who lived close enough to offer refuge, the practical need for a wife's labor that prevented excessive abuse. The geographic scope of marriages differed enormously. Royal marriages might unite partners from different kingdoms, speaking different languages, following different customs. A French princess marrying into the English court would need to adapt to entirely foreign practices, surrounded by strangers who might view her with suspicion or hostility. Peasant marriages rarely involved moving more than a few miles. The bride might move to the next village, but she remained within the same cultural context, speaking the same dialect, following the same customs, probably maintaining connections with her birth family. The role of religion in sanctifying marriages showed interesting class variations. While both royal and peasant marriages required church blessing, the nature of that blessing differed. Royal marriages involved multiple high-ranking clergy, sacred relics, and elaborate liturgies that emphasized the divine sanction of dynastic unions. Peasant marriages might receive a brief blessing from a barely literate priest who performed dozens of such ceremonies yearly with little variation. Yet for the peasants, this simple blessing might hold deeper personal meaning than all the elaborate royal ceremonies. The expectations for marital fidelity varied significantly by class and gender. Royal men were expected to take mistresses, their infidelities ignored or even celebrated as signs of virility. Royal women faced destruction if even suspected of infidelity. Peasant men had fewer opportunities for affairs, but faced less severe consequences if discovered. Peasant women, like their noble counterparts, faced harsh punishment for infidelity, but the accusations and trials were handled locally rather than becoming matters of state. The role of witnesses in validating marriages served different psychological functions. For royalty, witnesses provided political validation, confirming that alliances were sealed and successions secured. Their presence was about power, not personal support. For peasants, witnesses were community members who would support the couple throughout their marriage. Their presence at the bedding ceremony created bonds of mutual obligation and shared experience that would last lifetimes. The material culture surrounding wedding nights, the objects, decorations, and gifts, revealed enormous disparities. A royal couple might receive jeweled cups, golden plates, tapestries depicting classical scenes of love and fertility. These objects would become heirlooms, passed down through generations, carrying the memory of that union forward through centuries. Peasant couples might receive a wooden spoon, a clay pot, perhaps a young chicken, practical items for daily survival that would be used up, worn out, and replaced without sentiment. The role of custom versus law in governing wedding night practices varied by class. Royal marriages were governed by complex legal frameworks involving canon law, civil law, and international treaties. Every aspect was regulated, documented, and subject to legal challenge. Peasant marriages operated more through custom than law. Local traditions, inherited practices, and community expectations shaped behavior more than distant legal codes that few understood or cared about. The seasonal timing of marriages showed different patterns across classes. Royalty could marry whenever political necessity or astrological favorability dictated. Their wealth insulated them from seasonal concerns. Peasants married according to agricultural rhythms, after harvest when food was plentiful, during winter when work was lighter, avoiding planting and harvesting seasons when every hand was needed. These patterns meant that peasant wedding nights were often influenced by exhaustion. weather, and the agricultural cycle in ways that royal marriages never experienced. The role of age differences in marriages varied significantly by class. Royal marriages might unite a young princess with a much older king for political purposes, creating wedding night dynamics shaped by vast disparities in experience and power. These age gaps were accepted as politically necessary. Peasant marriages, while also sometimes involving age differences, typically united partners closer in age who had grown up in the same generation of village life. The psychological dynamics of their wedding nights were shaped more by familiarity than by radical power imbalances. The aftermath of wedding nights had different implications for social mobility. A royal marriage might elevate entire families, creating new nobles, establishing new power networks, changing the fate of regions or nations. A peasant marriage typically reinforced existing social structures. The couple remained in their birth status. Their children would inherit the same position, and social mobility through marriage was virtually impossible. The wedding night began unions that either transformed kingdoms or perpetuated ancient patterns of subsistence. The role of female agency, limited though it was across all classes, manifested differently. Royal women might exercise influence through their children, their access to powerful husbands, their ability to serve as regents. Their wedding nights began political careers of sorts. Peasant women had different forms of agency: knowledge of local herbs and healing, influence within village social networks, the essential nature of their agricultural labor. Their wedding nights began partnerships where their practical knowledge and labor were immediately essential for survival. The public memory of wedding nights served different social functions. Stories of royal weddings became part of national mythology, reinforcing ideas about divine right, noble bloodlines, and political legitimacy. Stories of peasant weddings, passed down orally within communities, reinforced local values about proper behavior, gender roles, and community solidarity. Both types of stories shaped cultural understanding of marriage, but at different scales and with different implications. As we near the conclusion of this segment, we see how the medieval wedding night was never simply about two people beginning a marriage. It was about performing social roles, reinforcing hierarchies, creating alliances, and perpetuating systems of power. Whether in a golden bed surrounded by bishops or on a straw pallet surrounded by chickens, the wedding night was a public performance where private desire met social obligation. As our long journey through medieval bedchambers draws to a close, we find ourselves back in the present moment, surrounded by the quiet comfort of our own private spaces. The stories we've wandered through tonight, of public ceremonies and private terrors, of witnessed intimacies and performed consumptions, they seem almost impossibly distant from our modern understanding of love, marriage, and human dignity. Yet these tales from centuries past reveal fundamental truths about human nature and social power that echo through time. The medieval wedding night, in all its public spectacle and private anguish, shows us how profoundly culture shapes our most intimate experiences. What seems natural and inevitable to one era appears bizarre or barbarous to another. The bedroom, that most personal of spaces, has always been a battlefield where individual desire meets social expectation. We've seen how the medieval world made marriage a community event in ways that seem almost unimaginable now. From the crowded cottage where entire families witnessed consummation to the golden chambers where ambassadors validated royal unions, privacy as we understand it simply didn't exist. Every marriage began with an audience. Every intimate moment was potentially public. Every personal feeling was subjected to communal judgment. The story of Gerald of Aurillac reminded us that even in ages of systemic oppression, individual conscience could spark transformation. His journey from would-be rapist to saint might trouble our modern sensibilities, but it illuminates how power corrupts and how even the smallest recognition of another's humanity could seem miraculous in a world built on dehumanization. The unnamed serf woman who escaped his assault, whose voice we'll never hear, whose story we'll never fully know. She haunts these histories, representing countless others whose experiences were erased or absorbed into tales of powerful men's redemption. The mystery of Prima Nocta, whether historical reality or persistent legend, forces us to confront the vulnerability of those without power, particularly women, especially poor women, throughout history. Whether lords formally claimed the right to rape brides or simply exercised that power informally, the threat shaped behavior, influenced decisions, and traumatized generations. The debate over evidence misses the larger truth that sexual violence was woven into the fabric of medieval power structures. The contrast between royal and peasant weddings reveals how class has always determined not just material comfort, but the very nature of human experience. The same ritual, joining two people in marriage, could be a glittering diplomatic ceremony or a crude public spectacle, depending entirely on the participant's social position. Yet across all levels of society, the wedding night was never truly private, never fully consensual in our modern understanding, never separated from economic and political calculations. Tonight, as you lie in your own bed, in your own room, with doors you can lock and privacy laws that protect you, consider what we've gained and perhaps what we've lost. The medieval wedding night was traumatic in ways we can barely fathom, but it was also communal in ways we might not fully appreciate. Those witnesses, however intrusive, also served as protection and support. Those communities, however oppressive, also provided frameworks of meaning and belonging that many modern people struggle to find. The evolution from public bedding ceremonies to private wedding nights tracks broader changes in human consciousness. The rise of individual rights over communal obligations. The recognition of bodily autonomy as a fundamental human dignity. The slow, incomplete, but persistent movement toward equality between genders and classes. Each generation has pushed slightly further toward recognizing the full humanity of all people, though that work remains far from finished. Think of those medieval brides, noble and common alike, approaching their wedding nights with fear, resignation, perhaps occasionally hope. They had no language for consent as we understand it, no framework for equality in partnership, no expectation of privacy or personal choice. Yet they loved, they endured, they created lives and families and communities. Their strength in the face of systematic oppression is both heartbreaking and inspiring. The medieval wedding night also reveals how sexuality has always been regulated, controlled, and shaped by power structures. From the Church's attempts to sanctify and limit sexual expression to feudal lords' exploitation of those beneath them, from royal marriages that sealed international alliances to peasant unions that perpetuated agricultural labor systems, sex and power have always been inseparable. The bedroom has never been truly private because what happens there has always had public consequences. As you drift toward sleep, let these ancient stories settle into the quiet corners of your mind. They are tales from a world both utterly foreign and startlingly familiar. The specific customs have changed, but the human experiences, desire and fear, hope and resignation, the search for connection amidst constraint, these remain constant across centuries. The candles that lit those medieval bedchambers have long since burned to nothing. The witnesses to those ancient ceremonies have returned to dust. The very buildings where these scenes played out have mostly crumbled or been rebuilt beyond recognition. But the echoes of those nights persist in our laws, our customs, our deepest assumptions about marriage and intimacy. Consider how the concept of privacy, which we take for granted, is actually a relatively recent invention. For most of human history, life was lived communally, every action observed, every sound overheard. The medieval wedding night was just one particularly dramatic example of this public existence. Our modern ability to close a door, to be alone with our thoughts and desires, to choose when and how to reveal ourselves to others, this is a privilege our ancestors couldn't have imagined. Yet privacy brings its own challenges. The isolation many modern people feel, the difficulty of forming deep community bonds, the burden of making life's major decisions without communal support. These are the shadow sides of individual autonomy. The medieval wedding night was traumatic, but it was also a community event that bound people together in shared experience and mutual obligation. As this long night's journey through history comes to its close, we return to where we began. With you, in your comfortable bed, in your private room, in a world where marriage is increasingly a choice between equals, where consent is recognized as essential, where privacy is protected by law, if not always by technology. You live in an era that those medieval couples could never have imagined, with freedoms they never knew to want. But you also carry within you the echoes of their world. In every wedding tradition that persists, the white dress symbolizing virginity, the father giving away the bride, the expectation of consummation, we see shadows of medieval practices, sanitized, romanticized, but still present. The past is never truly past. It lives on in customs we follow without understanding their origins. The stories we've shared tonight, of Gerald and his unnamed victim, of Prima Nocta whether real or legendary, of royal splendor and peasant squalor, they're not just historical curiosities. They're reminders of how far humanity has traveled toward recognizing the dignity and autonomy of every person, and how far we still have to go. The medieval wedding night, in all its public spectacle and private suffering, stands as a milestone on that journey. As sleep approaches, let these ancient tales dissolve into dreams. Perhaps you'll dream of castle chambers hung with golden tapestries, or cottage corners where families huddle for warmth. Perhaps you'll hear the echo of Latin prayers or peasant songs, the rustle of silk or the scratch of straw. Or perhaps you'll simply sink into grateful darkness, appreciating the profound privilege of privacy, the luxury of choosing your own path, the dignity of being recognized as a full human being with rights and choices. The medieval world we've explored tonight was shaped by different values, different possibilities, different constraints than our own, but the people who lived in it were as fully human as we are. They felt joy and sorrow, desire and revulsion, hope and despair. Their wedding nights, however different from ours in form, were beginnings of marriages, of families, of dynasties, of new chapters in the endless human story. Tomorrow you'll wake to a world where marriage is increasingly optional, where privacy is largely protected, where consent is recognized as fundamental. But tonight, as you drift between waking and sleeping, you can carry with you the memory of those who had none of these privileges, who began their marriages in crowded rooms with uninvited witnesses, who faced their wedding nights with courage we can barely imagine. Let their stories settle into silence now. Let the crowded chambers empty, the witnesses withdraw, the candles gutter and die. Let the past recede into the comfortable darkness of sleep. You are safe in your own space, free to choose your own path, protected by centuries of slow progress toward human dignity. The medieval wedding night, with all its terrors and rituals, its publicity and performance, its violence and occasional tenderness, it belongs to history now. You belong to this moment, this quiet present, this gentle drift toward dreams. Let the weight of those ancient stories lift from your shoulders. Let the comfort of your own bed, your own room, your own choices surround you. Sleep now, carrying with you only the gentlest echoes of the past, the understanding that every freedom you enjoy was won through centuries of struggle, that privacy and dignity and choice are precious precisely because they were so long denied, that the ability to close your door, to choose your partner, to own your body, these are not inevitable but hard-won victories in humanity's long journey toward justice. The medieval world fades, your breathing slows, the present moment wraps around you like the softest blanket. You are here, you are safe, you are free. The witnesses have all gone home. The ceremonies are complete. The night is yours alone. Sleep well, dear friend, until we meet again in history's winding corridors. Another night, another journey, another glimpse into the strange and terrible and beautiful past that made us who we are. Good night.